This important session on the post-crisis economic order. We have an excellent panel with Chanda, Kochhar, and of course, the Distinguished Minister of Finance. And just to give a bit of context on the complexity of this issue, when we were together here a year ago, international trade seemed to be in a very difficult situation. As you recall, international trade flows were falling at an unprecedented rate. Taiwan and certain other economies had exports dropping by 40 or 50%. And the specter had been raised through Buy America and other actions of new rounds of protectionism and memories of the Great Depression, where trade was falling inexorably, quarter by quarter, down to a mind-numbing and soul-destroying 60% reduction. Here we are 12 months later, and it appears that there's a different reality. The WTO and the OECD expect that exports and international trade flows will actually rise this year. Anti-dumping cases at the WTO are down a quarter from 2001. In fact, in many areas, the world's trade flows are more liberal than they were 12 months ago because of continued implementation of pre-existing agreements. So the question has been raised, isn't that protectionism the dog that barked but didn't bite? For this kind of complex conversation, a Minister of Finance of today not only has to understand domestic financial issues, but also global issues. And therefore, we're extremely privileged to have with us here today Minister Mukherjee, who combines the deep understanding of domestic financial issues with leadership role on the global scene as well over the years. So it's my great pleasure right now to invite the President of the Confederation of Indian Industries, Mr. Srinivasan, to come and introduce the topic and the Minister. Thank you very much.
The Honorable Finance Minister of India, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, Mr. Robert Greenhill, Managing Director, World Economic Forum, Ms. Chanda, Kochhar, Chief Executive of ICICI, and distinguished business leaders, ladies and gentlemen. It is really a great privilege for me, on behalf of CII and WEF, to welcome our special guest, the Honorable Finance Minister, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee. He is truly an eminent statesman in the Indian political scene. His sagacity and wisdom have stretched his resources to meet every crisis that the country and the government has faced. I think there is no group of ministers which is not advised or led by him to deal with the kind of issues that the country faces today. I think there would be none better than him to speak to us on this occasion. I am not quite qualified, nor does the Honorable Minister need an introduction. His illustrious career and his contribution to India's development in various areas are well known. In his current stint as Finance Minister, as he has been there earlier, was probably one of the most challenging. In the backdrop of the global meltdown, a crisis that had epic proportions, recalling the days of the Great Depression in America, he took the challenge head-on and introduced several measures to stabilize the Indian economy. Under his leadership, the number of stimulus packages that were introduced has resulted in India having a very short downturn of less than 4 months before we have rebounded into very solid, positive growth territory. Thanks to his untiring and visionary efforts, The economy today is not only well established to grow towards 7 and hopefully 9, 8 and 9% in the years to come, but he is spearheading various critical reforms, probably the most important reforms financially the country has seen since the liberalization. One is the GST, a unifying goods and services tax that will really make India one common market with one rate of taxation. The second is simplification and equitable direct tax code, which will hopefully be litigation-free and easy to understand and rule-based. But in the meanwhile, the last budget has shown his concern for the common man, his concern for the people who have been left behind in India's 20 years of reform. And the social sector has benefited greatly from his allocations to rural employment, women's literacy, healthcare, and going forward to national highway development, electricity and power capacity, and most importantly today, urban renewal. Today we find the national responses of various countries to the global crisis has been increased protectionism, control of money flow by many countries, of money coming in or going out. In fact, protectionism is rearing its ugly head, and this will be to the detriment of all countries. It will be as much to the detriment of the developed countries as it will be to the developing countries. We also had, unfortunately, the great collapse in America and Wall Street of Lehman Brothers and the subsequent almost nationalization of American institutions like banks and automobile companies. This brings into sharp focus the question of whether free market is the right process or we need a regulated market. But the truth, sir, is that from CII, we believe that an untrammeled, unregulated free market, while it is bad, a completely regulated and rule-bound bureaucratic market also stifles innovation, stifles growth, and will not result in the inclusive growth that our economy needs. Therefore, we need to strike a balance between a free market with healthy regulators and transparent regulation. And I know, sir, under your leadership, whether it be SEBI or whether it be the telecom or various sectors like insurance, that India will have a process of reasonably free markets, but with adequate regulation to safeguard the weaker interests of our society. To recap, after the aftermath of the global financial crisis, we now have debates on free trade. We have two significant issues, sir, that face us. The first issue is the WTO Doha round, to which your government, our government rather, and is really seriously committed to. The Commerce Minister has made it known at every forum that India will be a partner in the Doha round to see a successful culmination of a free trade agreement across the world. The second issue is a climatic change. While climate change has a stark divide, a chasm almost, between the developed countries and the developing countries, I think we cannot disagree that if the climate change is not brought under control, the rising seas and change of climate will cause great misery to countries like India and China with deltas, basins, and large coastlines and coastal cities. And therefore, it is as much in our interest as in the interests of developed countries to come to an equitable method of settling this in a manner which gives headroom for the developing countries to grow, while it does entail some sacrifice from the developed countries to bring down their consumption. So with these words, sir, may I once again thank you for coming and welcome you to the World Economic Forum.
Honorable Minister, could I request you to please?
Mr. Robert Greenhill, my good friend Venu Srinivasan, Chanda, Kochhar, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the very outset, let me express my deep gratitude and appreciation to CII and organizers of this conference, 25th one, Economic Summit, which is being organized by CII over the years. When we are addressing this congregation, I have just come back from the G20 Finance Ministers Conference, where the mandate which we received from the leaders at the summit at Pittsburgh were A, to make a review and recommend to the leaders for the next summit what further corrective measures are necessary to ensure that the world economic recovery process gets stimulus. 2, how to ensure the financial stability across the world. Third, the subject was to discuss about the financing of climate change. And finally, what would be the exit strategy? Now the countries shared their perceptions. I'm not going to the details of it. The communique issued after the 2 days conference reflect the spirit in which the discussions took place. I would like to give you a very brief account. How did we respond to this situation? First of all, the impact. Of course, the adverse impact was felt from the middle of the 2000 year. Year 2008, we felt the adverse impact. The first half of 2008, we had to confront with a peculiar situation where high commodity prices, including the oil prices, which reached as high as $147 per barrel in August, created a difficult situation for our economy. And before we could absorb that shock, then the meltdown came and we had to respond. We found that the situation is deteriorating very fast and we shall have to come out with certain corrective steps. Prime Minister decided to ensure that further deterioration in the growth is to be prevented. And he came out with 2 stimulus packages in the month of December 2008, January 2009, and the 3rd stimulus package I provided in my interim budget in February. The objective was to ensure there is no further deterioration in the growth process. India registered 9% GDP growth continuously for the previous 3 years, and a compact 5-year period, our total GDP growth was 8.6%, which is reasonably high compared to 3.5%, which was the average growth rate for 3 decades since our developmental planning began. In the 80s, we registered 5.6% GDP growth. In the 90s, it is little more than 6.5%. And the last 5 years' growth, as I mentioned just now, it was 8.5%. So how to achieve that objective? We decided it will take some time for the world economy to recover, and the demand generated in the external sector will take some time show how quickly we can generate demand domestically, which will ensure our growth. At least it would not further deteriorate. And you have seen the results as the impact of the stimulus package. We could achieve the modest growth rate of 6.7% at the end of the financial year 2008-9. If you compare it with the previous 2 quarters figure, you will find that it was reasonably acceptable. Now the question comes, how we would proceed further from here? The type of stimulus package which we provided, how long it would continue? Prime Minister, I understand, has responded to this question that it cannot continue for a long period of time. Umpteen number of times I have stated that it will have its in due course, we shall have to take the corrective measures. But still I do feel the strong domestic demand is necessary, and how to adjust it with the basic questions which has been raised while introducing me, that how are we going to respond to it if the world goes for more and more protectionist way, if the resources available from the external sources get shrinked, and how to take the corrective measures collectively, and including the problem of the successful conclusions of Doha round of trade negotiations and climate changes, both in terms of finance and the commitment of reduction for emissions, how India is going to respond to these major issues. My first response is, as I have stated, to generate the domestic demand, it will continue for some more time. And for that, what we are to do? We are to make massive investment in agriculture. We are to make massive investment in infrastructure. We are to ensure that the industrial revival which began, which has been reflected in the figure available for the industrial production index in month of August, 10%, and prior to that in July it was 7%, in June it was 8%. So to maintain that momentum and also to ensure that massive investment in the infrastructures. What I have narrated in my fiscal proposals in my budget speech, I am not going to speak it out, but the short point which I would like to drive at, that there is a need of generating strong domestic demand till the robust recovery of the economy over the world, particularly in the developed world, take place. I have a very limited interest as former Commerce Minister when I am finding that in 12 consecutive months my exports are going down, and when I am sharing my perception with my colleague in the Ministry of International Trade, that unless the robust recovery in the developed economy takes place, as India's export destination to those developed countries, Europe, North America and Japan taken together, are accounting for more than 60% of total export destination, it is not easy for us to diversify the market overnight and to make up the loss which we are having. So we shall have to wait for some time. And as fast as it is recovering, we shall have to respond to that and take the corrective measures. So far the investment in agriculture is concerned, it is not merely by enhancing the public expenditure. The innovation which we shall have to look into it, a strong linkage between research and development, so that the productivity and the skill of the individual workers also enhance substantially. And there should be a close link between the laboratory and the land, research and development organizations, agricultural universities, and other institutional arrangements which we are having, so that yield per hectare increases, skill and productivity of the workers increase to the optimal level, because we know there is limitation of the land and the requirement of the people, because we are a growing population and nobody in the world can feed 1 billion plus population if there is an acute shortage. And the developmental strategy which we adopted in the earlier years, it has ensured that we could produce enough grain to meet our requirements despite the adverse impact of deficient rainfall and flood in the latter part of the year. We are not worried over the availability of the food grains, because we are starting the food season, so far rice is concerned, with 7.6 million tons surplus, and we are starting the wheat season from 1st of April with about 7.6 million tons of surplus, so that whatever be the production of the current year, and of course to have the adverse, to have the moderate influence over the prices, we are maintaining the supply management by ensuring the availability from imported sources of the commodities which are in short supply. But agriculture is one of the important area for our developmental strategy and massive investment we would like to have. Though the share of agriculture is coming down, and rightly so, it is encouraging. From 20%, it is now currently 17%. The second area of emphasis for our developmental strategy would be the massive investment in the infrastructures: road, transport, communication, power. And particularly in the power sector, there is a little slippage which we shall have to make it up. 78,000 megawatt additional power generation capacity which was targeted for the 11th plan period, we shall have to make serious efforts to ensure that we can make it up. Otherwise, power shortage may cause some problems, as it is causing already some problems in certain critical areas. The third area of concentration will have to be the appropriate fiscal and monetary policies. One of the major reasons of our success stories in the last 5 years, 6 years, our vigorous private sectors, and also our rate of domestic savings and rate of investment. Our rate of domestic savings increased substantially from 24% of GDP to more than 36% of GDP. And our rate of investment have increased from 22% of GDP to 39% of GDP, just in a span of the period from 2001 to 2007-8. Therefore, this trend is also to be maintained. Therefore, our fiscal policies should be to ensure that there should be more incentives for savings and investment, and little bit discouragement for savings and expenditure. Keeping that in view, the last point on which I would like to emphasize on, that when Prime Minister mentions that the stimulus package we shall have to wind it up, he has very much in his mind the fiscal consolidation, which is absolutely imperative. We had to do it. As I mentioned, that we wanted to generate the domestic demand, massive investment in the rural infrastructure, health, education, social sector. And for that we had to do, I will give you just one example. By one go, I stepped up the developmental outlay annually from 2,85,000 crores to 3,25,000 crores. 40,000 crores step up was done in the budgetary allocations for plan for the year 2008 and 9-10. Therefore, this was a massive. As a consequence to that, we had to borrow heavily from the market. But we had to ensure that government's borrowing does not elbow out the private sector's legitimate credit requirement. And fortunately, with the cooperation of our central bank, we have been able to manage that. Most of the borrowing of the government is almost 3/4 of it is over, and private sector's credit requirement has not been elbowed out, and they did not have to face this problem. But this type of tightrope walking cannot be continuing for a longer period of time, so we shall have to come back to the fiscal consolidation. which I myself indicated in my budget observations, that by what point of time I would like to reduce the fiscal deficit from 6.8% at the current level to 4% by 2012, and my revenue deficit from 4.5% to 1.5% by 2012, which we almost achieved in 2007-8. And from where, in fact, fiscal deficit we came down to 2.5% in 7-8, where we had to step it up. I would not like to take more time of yours by introduction. Therefore, my response to the trend which has been pointed out, the protectionism, that is not the answer. And if we go for the protectionism, as the world leaders are repeatedly pointing out, whether it is in London or in Washington or in Pittsburgh, that protectionism is not the answer. There should be collective cooperation amongst the nations, and G20 practically represents the 80 to 85% of the world economy. Therefore, if they can work collectively and cooperatively, there would be no need of any retrograde state. And the two of the pending issues which are lying, we shall have to ensure it. I am quite confident that the outcome of Copenhagen conference on climate change would be positive and would help us. The only short comment which I would like to make, here in the historical background, the developed countries will have to keep in mind the approach which has been accepted, and it is well established that the responsibilities would be common but differentiated and depending on the capabilities of the state concerned. For adaptation and mitigation, we will have access to the clean technology at an affordable cost. And now there comes the questions of the funding of climate change. There, of course, we could not agree, but we have left it to the leaders who will be assembling in the Copenhagen, and the appropriate forum we consider should be United Nations Framework for Climate Change, Framework Convention for Climate Change. They should adequately address this issue, but there is a commitment that Annex 1 countries, industrialized countries who have committed this mistake over the years, not 1 year or 2 years, but over 200 years, they will have to bear the responsibility. Our reduction commitment has already been indicated by Prime Minister, though it is per capita, much less than compared to any other developed country. But we will never exceed the per capita emission at any level of our developmental trajectory beyond the level of the per capita emission of the developed countries. That firm commitment we have made. We have taken certain other steps also, but I would not like to burden you with those steps. Therefore, I would like to conclude by saying, problem is no doubt serious, but at the same time, collective determination, as it has been demonstrated by the world leaders in 3 summits, we have been able to come out of the very difficult situation. World economy is in the process of recovery, as it was stated by Central Bank Chairman of the USA in the G20 Finance Ministers meeting on 7th. So let us hope that it would accelerate, and as and when we go working in close cooperation, hand in hand, with the ultimate objective of not taking any retrograde state, but taking the forward-looking progressive step, we will be able to address the problems of the international community, and we will be able to do justice to our fellow citizens. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the patience.
Honorable Minister, let me first of all thank you for such a comprehensive view of the steps or the response that India took to the global meltdown, and very clearly having charted out what we need to do going from here. Actually, you very clearly mentioned that The signs of the meltdown were anyway visible from early 2008. And clearly, the right response that the government and the regulators had was to focus on our inherent strength, that is domestic consumption, and ensure that the entire stimulus moves in a way that domestic consumption continues to remain strong. And it is really to the credit of the government, Honorable Minister, that we put out stimulus packages on time in the appropriate size and measure, which enabled the Indian economy to keep moving at modest growth rates. Sir, actually you also, you mentioned about the stimulus. In fact, the regulators need to take credit of one more credit really during this period, which is that we as a country continue to maintain a very appropriate balance between regulation and an open economy. And I think this is a lesson that, again, the world needs to learn from India, because otherwise the world, in a way, the Western countries are moving from one extreme to the other, an extreme of having very little regulation to an extreme of going to extra protectionism and extra regulation. But I think India always continued to maintain this appropriate balance, and that worked well in the favor of India. Sir, you clearly said that going forward, we have three focus areas to ensure development and growth, that is agriculture, infrastructure, and appropriate fiscal and monetary policies. And I think this will comprehensively actually take the growth of the Indian economy forward, because what the Indian economy is going through is actually a very nice point of economic development, because the last 7-8 years, growth has been driven by domestic consumption. And as domestic consumption has led to economic growth, per capita incomes have gone up. And it is this, with this current level of per capita incomes, it's actually the Indian consumer will demand more products, will demand more infrastructure, and will be ready to even pay for infrastructure. So with the current level, we will actually drive investment process. And therefore, going forward, the country will have two drivers of growth, not just domestic consumption, but domestic consumption and investment. And I'm actually very happy to state that while a lot of infrastructure and other manufacturing projects were in the pipeline 1 year ago, but in the last 1 year, many corporates had put those projects at the back burner. But now one is clearly seeing that all those projects are coming back on the front, and the corporates are making plans to go ahead with their investment plans. And that, I think, is going to be the next driver of economic growth for India. Sir, you clearly also mentioned, you gave a very clear message. Or before I come to that, I think I just wanted to say that when we now have two drivers of growth, that is domestic consumption and investment, actually I liked it very much when you said that the country grew at modest growth rates of 6.7%. I think when you go to the Western world, 6.7 is a very, very high rate of growth. But as Indians, it's very important for us to keep believing that this is a modest rate of growth, because the country has a potential of going to 9 and 10%. And it's only when all of us, the government, the regulators, the industry captains, and the financial sector believes that 6.7 is modest, can we all work together to take the country back to 9 and 10%. And I think all of us sitting here will work with the government to make that happen. Sir, you gave out a very clear message to the world to say that protectionism is not an answer to find solutions to what has happened. I think it's important to work in collective cooperation amongst nations, is what you said. And I just wanted to add one more point, that one, India really maintained, therefore, a very good balance between regulation and open economy. The second is the importance of self-regulation, because I think the world has to realize that everything cannot just be imposed by protectionism and very tight regulations. Even during the period where regulations may or may not be very tight, there is some amount of self-regulation that all responsible sections of the economy have to follow to ensure the health of the economy. I think India again stands out as a very good example here, because if you look at the financial sector, the reason for the stability of the financial sector in India, I think there are three contributors to that stability. The first contributor is clearly the policymakers and the government, because I think our regulations were always very good, very tight, very sound, very stable. That meant that the financial sector would continue to remain stable. We did not allow products which nobody understood. We maintained very strong liquidity ratios, etc., for the banks, which today the world is talking of in terms of leverage ratios. But that was one section. The second was that the banks themselves, in a way, were pretty self-regulated, because within the regulations, nothing really stopped the banks from going ahead and offering home loans of the kind that the Western banks were doing, zero interest loans, and keep on lending against asset bubbles. But the Indian banks always continued to lend only against income. All our housing loans were given only if the person had the income to support it, and not just treat the home like an ATM machine where every year the customer would come and draw against the home. And I think the third important segment that deserves credit is the Indian consumer itself. Because again, Indian consumer, while in the last 10 years, has started borrowing to create assets. So that's a shift from what the situation was 20 years ago. But still the borrowings, the leverage was limited to their earning capacity. They never went overboard to borrow without having a reasonable eye on the repayment capacity. So I think self-regulation also plays a very important role as the country progresses and develops. So, sir, before I throw open the field to the viewers for any questions, so do you have any comments to make on, say, self-regulation, and also on how do you think and believe we can take our country back to the 9 and 10% growth rates?
You are correct that self-regulation, and it is not merely a theoretical proposition, as we have seen the performance of India's financial sector's performance during this period, that it has helped. And I do agree with you, that is the cardinal principle, that we shall have to strike a balance between the two extremes. We cannot have a system where everything will be free for all. And then this type of problem, total lack of regulation, will bring to a situation which we had. And there is no logical explanations. We are trying to find out some explanations that compensation mechanism or whatever it may be was not in operation. But the fact remains that we depended too much on the forces, that they will find a solution in course of them, which always does not happen. So there should be a regulation. But regulation must be transparent, it must be appropriate, and I'm emphasizing on appropriate. One set of regulatory principles need not necessarily be carried on. It will always have to be adjusted with the changing conditions of the market and the socio-economic environment. Fortunately, we could do that, and because we could do that, whether in our adjustment in the monetary policy through the crucial rates or through the SLR, CRR.
Liquidity.
So when we could do that, make that appropriate changes, keeping in view the requirement of the economy, requirement of the society at large, that type of regulatory mechanism will have to be evolved. And there I must say, innovation is most important. You cannot put it in the textbook with set of rules, as it will go on constantly changing as you are dealing with the living beings, not with some static objective, but the situation is truly dynamic and ever-changing.
Absolutely, sir. The balance between regulation and innovation is the key theme that the world also needs to learn. And sir, any further views on how we all can work together to take the country to the 9 and 10% growth rates?
First of all, I will be little conservative in my assessment. I do hope that if situation remains normal, because last year was abnormal, in some parts of the country we had deficient rainfalls, but in some other parts we had flood, excessive rainfalls which led to flood, and both caused harm to our standing crop in some parts. But what I am talking of, that I think before the end of the 11th plan we will be able to maybe by 2012, we will be able to reach the magic figure. But I will be happy if I have 7% plus for the next year and 8% for the year after that. And thereafter, I think momentum will gather and it will be possible to have 9 to 10% surely during the initial years of the 12th plan period.
Thank you, sir. That was, again, a very balanced approach to how we should aspire and how we should take the country forward. So with this, I'll open the floor for questions. Anyone wants to start? Yes, Ramkrishna.
So China had announced about 600,000 crores in terms of their package, in terms of the stimulus. Whereas at the same time, we had announced an equivalent package of about 60,000 crores. My question is, sir, it was a great opportunity for us to stimulate investments in infrastructure so that we can catch up in terms of the opportunity. I would like to have your comments on that. And the second question, sir, is Indian economy was doing pretty well even when there was a global meltdown. But we took some drastic decisions in terms of curbing inflation, probably because elections were there in certain states and probably for the Lok Sabha subsequently. You were not the finance minister then. I don't know whether you would like to comment on that, whether government policy resulted in a slowing down of the Indian economy. Otherwise, I personally perceive we had an opportunity to hit about 9 to 10% GDP growth in 2008-9, if not for the deceleration that we infused into the economy.
I will answer your second question first. If you have the tight money policy which we had to follow by restricting the credit because of the global inflations and as reflected in the domestic inflation, I would say no, it was not that. Because if you look at, I will give you just one example. Up to August, our exports were doing well. But from September onwards, it started, September figure as reflected in October. October onwards it started going down and still it is going down. This is just one example to indicate that we had the late impact of the fiscal meltdown. But the adverse impact of the high rise of the commodity prices at that point of time, including imported energy, there was no option to the government but to accept that type of tight money policies, and I do not subscribe to the view that we would have achieved it. Because the last quarter, last 2 quarters, and when I mentioned the slowing down of the growth figure of the last 2 quarters before April, it indicates almost 6 months period from September onwards. That is the period when the adverse impact was felt. Therefore, from the hindsight, somebody may try to find out that this could have done, that could have done. That is always possible. I don't rule out that. But at that point of time, what was considered necessary to deal with, and it had nothing to do with the election, because nowadays we are confronted with a situation, hardly you will find 1 year when there are no elections in some major states. After all, India has as many as 28 countries. Apart from 543 members in the federal parliament, there are as many as 4,227 members in the provincial parliament, and whose elections are going on throughout the year in some parts or in other parts. So election had nothing to do with it. Thank you.
So the second question was on the infrastructure stimulus package. Was our scale and size?
Stimulus package is concerned, I'm sorry, I forgot that. Yes, we have made, even in my budget speech, I have indicated that 1,000 crores of rupees will be, 100,000 crores of rupees will be funded by IIFCL, and through these institutional arrangements, we are making massive investment in the infrastructure. And one of the crucial area, it is not stimulus package as such, but this is the investment requirement and the mechanism of PPP mechanism, public-private partnership. Through that mechanism, it would be possible for us to make massive investment in the road sector, in the power sector, in the communication sector, boats, and other transport sectors. So far the rural investment is concerned, I have made massive investment in all the flagship projects of the Prime Minister, each one of which is linked with the connectivity or irrigation, water, education, health. Therefore, investment in the rural infrastructures, investment in the physical infrastructures, and investment in the social infrastructure like health and education are the top priorities, and to the maximum extent, we shall have to make investment in these sectors to maintain our growth momentum. Thank you.
On the infrastructure, I would only add that, of course, some countries need to give a much larger stimulus because there is no underlying demand for additional infrastructure in those countries. So the stimulus is required just to keep generating economic growth. Whereas in India, there is actually a huge demand for infrastructure. So whatever in a way was our deficiency of the past is really an opportunity for the future. So even if we do not announce very large stimulus packages, I think as long as we make sure that in terms of policy environment, we create a facilitative environment that encourages investment in these infrastructure projects, because there is an underlying demand, I think you will see investment coming in through the public-private participation route. So our focus as a country should be that we maintain a facilitative environment to encourage investment. It's not necessarily that only the government has to keep putting in money in infrastructure projects. Yes, Mr. Mittal.
Vinod Mittal, yesterday in one of the forum, CEO forum, there was a discussion that whatever commitment we are giving to G20, we are not fulfilling. I think there is some communication gap between the G20 members and the various institutions who are involved in the system. They don't have clear understanding that what we are implementing in our country and what we are not implementing. So they get the impression that whatever commitment our country has given in G20, we are not fulfilling it. So I'd like to know if you can give some highlights here, some of the members who are there on the table, they can understand the situation.
You know, there is no question of any commitment. What we are doing, we are reviewing the situation, sharing the views, and trying to arrive at a common approach. But in specific areas, in the specific segments of subject which we are dealing with, for instance, climate change. Climate change commitment will not be in G20, and that is the point which we emphasize, that the appropriate fora to make commitment on climate change, whether in terms of reduction, whether in terms of funding, that will be UNFCCC. Not that. Similarly, commitment on trade will be on the Doha round of discussions. Commitment of exchange of information about the tax evasion and other things, which will be done through the FSB mechanism, of which we are going to be party to it. But broad general parameter of the world economy and how the world leaders collectively should address the problems which are coming, lack of investments, lack of trade, how to address those problems. It is a forum for exchanging of the views. It is not a forum like World Bank or IMF or WTO, where you are taking the decision in concrete terms. They are giving the broad general directions, and the concerned ministries, departments, governments, and international organizations are to act on it. I will give you just one example. In the Pittsburgh summit, the leaders agreed that there should be a reforms in the financial architecture of the international financial architecture, and the quota of IMF should be increased at least at 5%, and World Bank share should increase at least at 3%. Now it is for the fund and bank to decide whether it would be 3% or 4%, 5% or 6% or 7%. Broad general directions have come from the leaders of at the summit, but concretization will have to take place at the appropriate forum. Thank you.
Yes.
I am Satish Garotra. Excellency Minister, you have given a very comprehensive view of the Indian economy. Thank you very much. We are fully enlightened. Your conservative statement that you will be able to achieve 7-8% next year, I am of the view that you can achieve 10% within the next 2 years if you cut red tapeism and bureaucratic delays in the government. Unfortunately, we are not gone behind the ladder in the Transparency International, the World Bank reports, the corruption level. We have not yet gone up at all. If your government can take some, suggest us or inform us what steps you intend to take to cut down the red tapeism and the bureaucratic delays. Thank you.
What is the latter part?
That we can accelerate our growth if we cut down red tapeism and corruption. Well,
Of course, these are the two perennial problems. There is no doubt in it. That's why I am suggesting that growth stimulus can be hastened first, and I myself admitted that we agreed to generate 78,000 megawatts power generation capacity, and country is really having power famine, and we require power badly, but we have not been able to do it. That's why we are trying to hasten it, and so that as fast as we can proceed and do that. But there is of course, the various mechanism we have taken. For instance, one idea which is, earlier there was a institutional deficiency that we did not subscribe to the code of the OECD countries in regard to the exchange of information of tax evasion, the clause 16 of the OECDs. So we have now amended that, we have accepted it. As a result, I have instructed my revenue department to reopen negotiations of all 77 double taxation avoidance agreement with all countries which we have entered so far, so that we can have real-time exchange of information, can track the tax evasion and tax avoidance, or stashing the black money in some other countries. One of the major contribution of the G20 summit was that all the world leaders have agreed to cooperate and to bring on board with those countries which are indulging the tax havens. And most of them are falling in line one by one, and I am quite confident that it will happen to tackle those problems at the micro level and also at the macro level. Thank you.
we have time for one last question. Yes.
I'm Georg Blume, India correspondent for the German weekly Die Zeit. Mr. Finance Minister, historically India has been critical of the Bretton Woods institutions. Now you are entering the G20 and you're sounding very confident in the G20 and its role. But effectively, financial regulators in the Western countries have failed terribly in the last years. So isn't there, when you are taking your new role in the G20 now, isn't there a remains of a fundamental Indian criticism of how the world has been ruled financially so far?
You know, we are sharing, now what is this forum? Let me once again explain it as I understand it. My appreciation of this forum is that it is not the decision-making forum, but it gives the guidance to the appropriate decision-making authorities that in what way the world leaders are thinking. First, the decisions, first the broad analysis is being made at the level of the summit. Thereafter, the G20 finance ministers mechanism is to implement the broad directions of the leaders at the summit and to carry it on till the next summit, and before the next summit, they give that these are the new problems have arisen, old problems we have tried to sort it out in this mechanism, new problems have arisen, now we seek your directions. How should we proceed? In that way we are functioning. And surely we learn from each other's experiences. When we share our experiences, the beauty of this organization or this type of forum are that when we share it, we gain from that experiences which the other countries have gained. That is a great benefit to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We've come to the end of our allotted time, but I must thank you for this comprehensive analysis of how we responded, how do we take the country forward, and what the G20 forum is all about. And I think we all go back with this approach that the government has a very clear thinking of how to accelerate the economic growth for the country. And this very big message to the world that excess protectionism is not the answer to all problems. We have to work in cooperation amongst nations. Thank you, sir.